Chapter 36. The Rock on the Schlossberg. 26th of July, 1840. 8:30 in the morning. The mentioned rock is located on the Schlossberg in Graz, to the right of the Gothic residential building in the former Dr. Gödel's garden. It can be reached through a back gate near a conical turret. From this rock, one overlooks the western area of Graz. 5 people wrote simultaneously what Jakob Lorber related concerning this rock. C.L., S., and H., D., and Ants H. According to the calculation of the human number, the Earth was founded 7 million years before the creation of man, and circled chaotically through space around the dull shimmering sun. It was a water ball in whose centre a solid mass gradually began to form, according to the will of the Creator. And this solid mass multiplied more and more through its inherent attraction. So much so that gradually rugged, undivided crystal-like peaks began to rise above the surface of the water. As a result, the earth became heavier and heavier by virtue of the nutrients it drew from the mercy love of God. But what this nutrient consisted of, it is not time to reveal yet. And now, when the earth on many and multiple sides began to rise above the surface of the waters in their solidity, winds began to blow over them, and the waves began to wash over the hard cliffs, loosening parts and pieces and depositing them as soft parts in the clefts of the large crystals. Now only was the earth gradually able to absorb the vegetation of herbs, grasses, bushes, and trees, first those under the water, and then those on the earth's strongholds, which state of plant growth alone had lasted for 70,000 years. Only then did the creation of the lowest animal classes begin, and then repeatedly, about every 2,000 years, one level higher, until finally the great time came for the creation of man, which is more like a release of him out of matter. However, after a few years, man became disobedient to God's commandments, and in the fury of the Godhead, the whole visible creation, except for small pieces of the earth, was almost completely dissolved in the fire and storms of God, so that from the centre of the earth to the surface thereof, not one stone was left intact, but was crumbled into small and tiny pieces. And even these pieces would have been destroyed if they had not been held together by love. For merciful love then became again one with the Godhead, through a mediating representation from its innermost reason. It pleased the Godhead again to form worlds and earths and suns from the infinite chaos of worlds. But the destruction of the whole creation retained clearly legible marks and characteristics, as I myself now show to you here in your face. But 1,840 years after the creation of man, the same number as after the incarnation of the great God up to your present time, note 1, look, this country, or rather the whole continent you call Europe, was still largely buried under the stormy waters of the sea. But God's love saw the future in great clarity before him, and knew well that from that time on, after an equally long time, people would multiply greatly and very much. Then ignited, miles deep under the earth, the fire of love, the earth here and there, larger and smaller parts of it, and the fire burned mightily and lifted the solid layers, tearing them apart into the heights. And as the fire, through the indwelling power of God, created for itself larger and larger spaces under the layers of the earth, so the fire, with terrible violence, worked its way up to the surface in many places, and threw masses upon masses over the mirror of the floods in all possible directions. Mind you, this happened around the said time, namely 1,840 years after the creation of man. And as you now see the directions of the mountains on this mainland, you can also imagine the different currents of the underground fire. For there the great love of the Lord went criss-crossing in the depths of the earth, and prepared a fruitful dwelling place for the future people. However, not simultaneously as all these great elevation that you see here now rising high above the plains, I made the beginning, but almost 1,000 years later, when the abundance of waters was gradually lost in the open depths of the earth, and at this point, as you see it rising, the plain was still covered with water. There was still a solid rock of 2,000 fathoms deep under the earth, and the love of the Lord sank also into the middle of this. It was only a small spark of this divine firepower, but it was strong enough to lift these masses, as I put before you, up from the depths and make them rise above the floods at the present height. However, it did not emerge all at once as it is now, but after repeated outbursts of such divine power. Of course, I have emerged on a smaller scale and have come to stand in the place where you see me, as well as this whole mountain, of which I am a small part. But which mountain the people not so long ago made a few fathoms lower. For at the highest point, very high and steep rocks rose up almost in a circle, which were later destroyed by man to create a more even surface on this mountain. Even I, a lower part of the mountain, although standing here from primeval times, have suffered much of my former form, both through time and through the hands of people. Because several thousand years ago, the waves of the sea still rinsed at my forehead. Yes, even some monsters of the sea lived in my lap. Only according to the will of the Creator, in the depths of the midday regions of the earth, a great elevation of the mainland occurred in the same way through the fire of divine love from the depths of the earth. Behold, then the sea sank gradually in this land, so much so that here only great lakes, which you call inland seas, have remained. And then it happened, after these inland seas had existed for several hundreds of years, that the Lord, out of his merciful care, has made the whole of the midday part, which you now call America, to tread over the surface of the waters in such a way that these inland seas have come to stand so high above the actual surface of the sea that the heaviness of the waters, longing for their origin, begin to open their way through the softer parts of the mountains. And look, there, when the waters ripped the mountains apart, great stormy floods passed me by for 500 years. For what you now call the upper country, there, in the area where you have made a bridge, Weinselbrücke, Ed, over the river and on the mountains and old Caslia, Wilden, ed., stands a mountain which was 100 fathoms higher than it can be seen now. It was broken through by the great mass of the water. The floods of the highlands then poured into the great lake whose waters had washed around my foot and lifted it up again to my forehead, and multiplied the water so much that a mountain, which was some hours away from here in the lowlands, where also later a castle, Ruin Gosting, ed., was built and a market stands, was torn apart left and right. And the floods made their way on and on in the same way. Wherever they found a resistance, they tore the soft parts and filled up the hollows that were formerly in the sea. How high these floods have rose, everywhere the traces of the loosened stones will still show you, which have assumed a rounded shape by their rolling down. The first flood went high above my head, and it was not until a century later that the river reached a lowland and its mirror turned upwards to me. And again, after a century, it fell so low that it laid only a fathom deep over the whole plain, which you can see through me, from one mountain to another. And after another century, the river lost so much of its flow that it was only a 30th part as wide as the present river. Merbet, ed. And when the mountains were completely overgrown with trees and grass, a persecuted human race got lost in this land and lived on the heights, which were not yet called mountains, but Tauran. And when this people was discovered by a later following one, it first got the name as a mountain people, which people was finally driven out of their seats by another, stronger people, which came from the evening. And only a few remained to live on the almost inaccessible heights to this day. And so today there is already a third people more than 1,000 years in this land. However, I, as I stand here, was through long and extended times a very feared and dangerous point in this great stream. For the floods worked willfully on me and seemed terrifying and horrifying to anyone who looked at me from afar. And when later the people of the upland invented a kind of ship, which consisted of a few trees attached to each other, there were only a few of them so happy who would not have found ruin on my forehead. For although the surface of the river bathed my foot, its waves, terrifying to mortals, reached up to my forehead. And this area, which you now find so charming and beautiful, was a terror to people at that time. It was not until the times when a great city called Rome was built that the waters of the river gradually diminished, and the surf on this small mountain became less and less. And so finally the water on my morning side lost itself completely, and only on rare occasions did the tide rise to the height of my morning side, which you now call the glacis. And so I became accessible to people through it, when the fire that had been blazing out of my inner being until these times had ceased. Now that my crown was free of all bushes and trees, the Romans who later invaded this country used me as a point from which they made their observations over this whole area, and through it also searched for ways to get to the highlands, which at that time no longer had the name of the mountain dwellers, but was called Noria, also Noricum, that is, people who had already inhabited the plains and set out on the feet of the mountains. since their peaks had become inhospitable, because the floods of that time had washed away all the earth from them, and left it in the depths or at the feet of the mountains. Look, I have witnessed how these highlands and lowlands inhabitants of this country have been defeated in the most cruel way by the audacious Roman people. On my forehead, more than 100 children hurled at me by their own mothers found death. However, what happened to me only on a small scale, the biggest rocks in the highlands as well as in the lowlands would be able to tell you the most horrible examples of. But I, as a clumsy stone, am not cold and determined to make you a historian, and would rather give you a little more insight into my own surroundings, as far as my field of vision reaches. That this whole, now so-called mud plain, is only an alluvial land, you could convince yourselves by digging 100 fathoms, in places probably also 1,000 fathoms deep, where you would find several of my comrades who were thrown into the floods by the fire. Also, if you could lift up all this alluvial land, you would discover nothing but only crevices and rocks, in which you would find many fossilized sea monsters. However, at these places, as is lined up there where the old castle stands, except for the adjacent mountain, you would immediately find stone, as there used to be a mountain ridge under the floods. Further down, if you have been breaking stones, note 2, for some time, in the line as there is a small mountain, Mount Calvarian, on the surface where you have erected the sign of the cross, and continuing in this line to the rest of the mountains, which you call Plabuchch, you need not dig so much to reach the stone. So, for several hours lower down, where there's now a market called Wilden, you'd soon find stone left and right as well. But even at that part of this muddy ground where valleys enter it, you would or could also soon come upon rocks which are marked with the same insignia of the sea here and there, which I mentioned earlier. And such places I could show you by the hundreds along the whole length of the river. But you are still to have a look at these smaller and larger neighbouring mountains, and there you are to know that not more than at most 2,000 years have passed when these, my smaller and larger brothers, were still in full flames. And there is not a mountain in this country that was not originally created in this way. Only in your cradle land, which you call Asia, are there still primeval mountains, which immediately after the main destruction were assigned as homes to the pardoned people. But here in this land, if you would take the time and effort, you would also find stones on a high Alp, note 3, which lies between noon and evening from here, which were thrown here during the great scene of destruction that followed the misstep of the first human couple, and also find masses of several planets substantially different from my kind. Now this is all I can say and may tell you from my natural sphere, and you should not and do not have to worry about the further, deeper and mysterious nature. For these secrets lie in the depths of divine mercy and concern you little or nothing. But all this you have to expect from the grace of the Lord, as far as it is necessary for the ennoblement and immortalization of your liberated being. Amen. The speech ended 15 minutes past 11 in the morning. Footnotes. Note 1. Note well. Until your present time were the last words spoken by Jakob Lorber on the rock. All subsequent words he said in CL's room at the main square. Ans H. Note 2. Quarry on the upper trench. That is HSG. Note 3. Koralp near Schwamberg. D. HSG.